Glad to be doing this with you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm here with Charles and Hank and Martha, and I'm just, sorry, Charles, I'll start with you. And Gabrielle, sorry.
We've been talking in the back, so take it away, Adam.
Charles, we've been seeing over the past few months since the administration has taken office, we've seen a lot of images of heavily armed federal agents engaging in what they describe as acts of immigration enforcement. And I'm wondering what you make of these images that we're seeing and how they play with the public,
right,
and what they're intended to do.
Well, I believe that one of the points of all this is to create a tableau of terror. That terror requires notoriety, it lives on it. And they understand that they can get that in some locations more easily than others. And so when you have armed officers or on horseback in Los Angeles, that's an image they want. The confrontations in Chicago and now Portland are images that they want. The kidnapping off the streets are images that they want because they are serviceable, because you need vicarious trauma. You can't do it everywhere, so if you produce enough images that both deadens the response, that people, whether or not they are disgusted by it or not, because of repetition, they get used to it. That conditioning to barbarity is important for terror to succeed, and it creates, it summons the slave catcher, it summons that kind of bounty hunter sensibility that existed after the Fugitive Slave Act. That was also about crossing borders that was illegal. It was also about deputizing large numbers of people to do the work. In fact, everyone became a deputy, because if you somehow supported it, did not report it, you were then, culpable. That aesthetic they long for that aesthetic. And when you couple that with a resurrection of lost cause ideology, which was also about removal of imagery along with an erasing of narrative, you get a return to a moment in American history that was very useful for the erection of an oppressive state, which I believe is the goal once again.
Do you think that these images also help draw lines around people's conceptions of who an American citizen is, or or who is going to be seen as, whose citizenship is seen as suspect?
I think it is both to do, as you say, determine who is valued or who is valuable enough to be considered citizen, but also valuable enough to be human. So it is operating on both. There is the legal definition of citizenship, but there is also the dehumanization of whole classes of people. Can we pull Hispanic men off the street and people still go to dinner that night? And if we can do that often enough, people still go to dinners, people still watch Saturday Night Live as if nothing happened that day, then we tomorrow can push another 5 yards.
Gabrielle, I wanted to bring up your work, particularly around the convention movement, because the convention movement begins before the Civil War, before emancipation, and you have Black people engaging in politics before theoretically they're supposed to be able to engage in politics. And I'm wondering, what you think the convention movement has to teach us in this moment as people are concerned about the direction of American democracy and whether it's going to survive.
Thank you. I'm going to say just a little bit about the convention movement before I answer the question, because I think one of the things that this gathering is charting is both erasure, which I think is a word that covers over and erases the violence of the disappearance of history that's already been resurrected through the labor of so many generations of people who have done that work. Historians, artists, legal scholars have done the work of resurrecting a history, and now it's being disremembered. And so I want to talk about that violence before I answer that question, because disremembered, right, allows us to talk about disrespect. It talks about dismemberment, not just the dismemberment of our histories from American history, but also the dismemberment of us and other folks who have been disenfranchised from the body politic writ large, right? So that larger violence of dismemory is what is happening, I think. And one of the things that has been disremembered is the Colored Conventions Project. Historians have talked about it, have gone to those records, but we don't know generally that it began in 1830 in Philadelphia, responding to the expulsion of 2,000, at least that's the number that is used in the 1831 Colored Conventions. People from Ohio, not from the South, right? Black people from Ohio, families from Ohio, who are then dispersed violently from the state as the rights of African Americans that had been established are being pulled back at the very same time as the rights of white men are expanding. So I want us to think about, right, the historical cycles that allow white rights to expand while Black rights are constricting rights that people thought indeed were established. The rights, for example, to vote in Pennsylvania, which are disbanded in 1838. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but let me say what the convention movement is. It starts in 1830, which is before the American Anti-Slavery Society is founded, before the Massachusetts Slavery Society is founded, so before the formal founding of the antebellum anti-slavery movement. Just as Freedmen's Bureau, the Black newspaper, is founded before the Liberator, all right? So we're talking about genealogies of Black organization, of Black humanity that predate the history that we have been given in the public square, right? And it goes on not only to be an anti-slavery movement, but also to center educational access in free states and in other states, right? And again, the states are expanding, and so is the ideology, right? 1830, we are not yet, right, the country that we know now with the representation that we have now. And it also is advocating, these people, these delegates are coming together from multi-day meetings, also to talk about legal rights, rights to sit on juries, rights to witness. They're also talking about labor rights, and they're also organizing for freedom from state-sanctioned violence. And they do so in multi-day meetings that start with national conventions and then go on to state conventions. We only knew about the antebellum conventions, where they are practicing a parallel politics. Excluded from the public square, they are meeting in conventions, gathering delegates, putting out calls, putting out memorials and petitions to legislatures, right? But this goes on post-war, and it expands when 4 million people are freed, right? So the question is both about the lessons of organizing, that they are addressing white audiences and Black audiences simultaneously, as we heard actually a couple of sessions ago, or yesterday, I guess. All right, so that they have both addresses to white citizens and addresses to Black citizens. How do we, a lesson learned, speak to multiple audiences simultaneously in an age of surveillance? How do we create circuits, right, of knowledge that can both persuade our liberal allies and also speak to us within our own communities in rooms where we're saying, let's be careful to protect each other, right? So there is that question. Then there's also the question and the realization of the fact that we cannot take rights for granted, that history teaches us that they will rescind rights. And they will do it visually, right, with a tableau of terror in order to illustrate the fact that they can push the ball down the line when we just go back, not just to sleeping, but to watching football, right? So as they're pushing another ball down the line, right? So that's one of the other, I think, lessons we have. There are loads of other lessons. I'm not going to take up too much time, but I think the other lesson is about the resurrection of history and about our resurrectionary power. Theaster Gates talks a lot about recovery. We talk about historical recovery. We talk about the recovery of history, the recovery of memory. But the history waits for us. It waits for Dred Scott to talk about the 1811 massacre in his artwork. It waits for Theaster Gates to talk about David Drake, the South Carolinian poet who, when he was enslaved, was writing couplets on pots that are now in museums across the United States and are bid on in the millions, right? It waits for ancestors to come back and create films and recover suits, right, to give them justice. It waits for Marilyn Nelson and Elizabeth Alexander to tell stories through poetry, and it waits for historians, and it will wait for us again, right? It will. That is the hope. History is both patiently waiting. Our ancestors are patient, but they are also impatient. So how do we both have comfort in the fact that we will come back and get it, that we have a Sankofa imperative, don't we? Right? But also, we have an obligation to not let work get reburied, right? The work of justice, the work of art, the work of archives, the work of records, our history, our movements deserve a home, right? And we've been creating that home at the Color Conventions Project for the records of this 70-year movement that is the precursor of the NAACP, which so many of us had not heard about or had not inherited as part of our legacy.
Thank you so much for that, Gabrielle. Hank, Gabrielle spoke briefly about surveillance, and I was wondering if you could talk about how, about how your art or how you think of your role as an artist, how that has changed in the past few years, how the climate has changed, and what you think the role of an artist is in this moment.
Thank you. I should have gone before her, though. Could you talk about the book in your lap for a second? The cover, at least. Yeah. What was the quote you all said earlier?
We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper.
Whose 200th anniversary was just 2 weeks ago and was the most beloved Black poet of the 19th century and the most prolific Black novelist, and also a founder of the National Association of Colored Women.
And the quote was?
We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, but I want to hear more. I mean, we discussed.
Thank you.
We discussed earlier. There's a different climate around art now than there was in the past in terms of who's watching, who's paying attention, who wants to exploit artistic expression in a negative way, who wants to take something out of context, caricature it, ridicule it. And I'm wondering, as an artist, as someone who creates work that needs to be appreciated in its fullness, how are you experiencing that? What do you think needs to be done going forward?
Well, I do believe that we are experiencing a crisis of creativity. I think we're actually also in, some people have talked about it as the nadir, but I think this is another Great Depression. It's not an economic depression. It's actually, there's very few people I engage with who aren't experiencing some form of depression since the pandemic, and especially now. And that's across the political spectrum. And I believe that is a result of the crisis of creativity, that so many of us have become so accustomed to consuming media that does not challenge us. I'm alienated from my own thoughts. and I am constantly now working towards reconnection, because I always talk about my new best friend, who knows more about me than I know about myself, and I have a more intimate relationship than I do with my children. And the reality that a corporate's product has infiltrated my own humanity is something that I feel like was predicted in books like A Brave New World in 1984, and I believe there are people who have saw those books not as dystopian but as utopian and have created a playbook. And what I now am reminded of when I think about these conventions, when I think about a time where movements happened, where people were gathering together, I always go back to the importance of love. Thinking about Cornel West's statement that just is what love looks like in public, which Brian Stevenson also talks a lot about. It was love for oneself, love for community, love for one's enemies, that gave people the righteousness to do the work. I think so much of what we've learned over the past 10 years is self-righteousness, which does not really have love as part of it. And so within my own work, I am challenging myself daily, momentarily, moment to moment, to reconnect with, find that love for myself so that I can reflect that in the work into the world. Because what I believe we all are products of, like, when you really think about this sweet spot, I have two sweet spots, but like from the post-World War II United States of America until basically now, is arguably the most, I would say the greatest time to be definitely an American. And it was a result of people who, when the time they were born, there was the likelihood that they could come, the likelihood that we could be sitting here when Henry Ford was running his company. We are his wildest nightmare, right? And it was because people were willing to challenge the status quo and the world that they were in, and to use creative nonviolence, creative civic engagement, and unconditional love as a tool, not a weapon, but as a tool to disarm those who were willing to lynch, willing to disenfranchise by any means necessary. And so I think in this time, it's so important for us to, love our enemies as we love ourselves, because they are us. They are creating our world with us. And if we can't find love for them, they cannot find love for us. And I'm really frightened by this idea that we need to fight back, because I don't know that a lot of the people who I look up to have the viciousness required to fight in the way that is going to be required to overcome. And who will we be on the other end of that fight? So how can we dig deeper in our resolve and think about the 70-year struggle that created the pathway for the NAACP? How do we start to plan for generations to come, not just for our own benefit in this moment? So these are things with my work that I'm attempting to put out in the world as kernels of memory to remember the struggles of people from the past, but also to hopefully, through the work that I do in the public, touch future generations with the spirit of our ancestors. And so I see my work as passing that along.
Thank you so much for that.
you.
Thank you. Martha, you've written so much about birthright citizenship and the history of birthright citizenship, and complicating that concept for us. And one of the things you said is, every generation faces its own crisis of citizenship. So I was wondering, if you could describe what our current crisis of citizenship is, and whether you see a way out of it.
Well, I'm a historian, so I have to take us back a bit. But I will answer your question, because it is important, I think, for some of us, the contemporary crisis about citizenship, some of us has regarded it as not our fight. It's not our fight. So part of my message today is about how it is very much our fight. And the reason is because the men and some women who gathered in that 70-year colored convention movement, Black Americans on the outside trying to find a way in, were the originators in this country of the concept of birthright citizenship. Yes, the idea has old origins going back centuries, but it was Black Americans who picked it up, who breathed life into it, who insisted on it because they were in a fight for their very lives against colonization, against Black laws, against violence. And so we are the originators of this idea. It doesn't become part of the Constitution until we insist that it must be part of the Constitution. And I think for a long time that was the way we told the story, 14th Amendment and done. But of course we know that in the next generation, for example, Chinese Americans will be somehow said to be outside the bounds of the birthright principle, and it will take a long struggle and a Supreme Court battle in order for them to establish their claim to birthright. A little known story is about how American women in the early 20th century, when they married non-US citizens, were denaturalized. They lost their citizenship. Black women, white women, all American women. Another struggle. Mexican Americans, by the tens, if not the hundreds of thousands during the Depression, are forcibly ejected from this country. The idea being that those American citizens, if they are exiled, will make a place for the ongoing project of the white man's country. And many of us, I think, do know the story of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Again, tens of thousands of birthright citizens who are captured, detained, sent to camps, despite their full claim to the birthright principle. This moment is one I'm old enough to tell you we have been primed for decades. I have been around the legal scene in this country long enough to know that immigrant Americans, and in particular Latino immigrant Americans, have been vilified for generations by the time we get to this moment. We have all been primed to ask ourselves, right, do they really belong? Are they really Americans? Right? We've all been primed for this moment for a long time. But there's no question, right, that now we are seeing the full force of an old argument being brought to bear in legal and extra-legal ways. So how do we get here? Because the question has always been here, right? We've got here because we've been primed for this particular question. And now it is being posed to us as a nation, yes, in a challenge to the rule of law, and we heard a lot about that today. But I wanted to come back to Charles's point, because what I thought of as I was listening to you is how cinematic citizenship is in this moment. Are we witnesses when we open up our feed and we watch one more human being literally wrestling on the American streets, right, with masked vigilantes who purport to be the agents of law and order? Are we witnesses? Are we interveners? Are we targets? We are all being asked to position ourselves in this vivid cinematic way in what we might have thought should have been a debate for judges, a debate for members of Congress. Well, it turns out citizenship is the tussle today in our streets, and we're all being asked to position ourselves, I think, very vividly and viscerally in relationship to that.
Thank you so much, Martha. Now, I'm going to pivot off something Charles has written, but this question is for everybody who wants to weigh in. Charles, you've written about America going through sort of developmental cycles of racism. Are we, in this moment, in a new place in a cycle that we've never been before, or are we someplace that is, recognizable in our past?
To me, it's incredibly recognizable, as I said before. I mean, it is a slave catcher sensibility. It is a kind of a magnification of a carceral state. It is a tussle about citizenship and belonging. And those are themes that are part of our history. And we thought, this is the thing about how we experience life in the country. Our lived experience becomes our kind of anchor point, not the history books. And we are shocked when something that we read about becomes something that we now have to live, because we thought that was a sign to the grave. But history says this happens all the time, that things repeat, that no victory is ever fully won, that if you don't continue to hold the ground, you lose the ground. And so the fact that, this is, I'm a little bit older, but I have kids that are in their 20s and 30s, and they are completely shocked. These are kids who came into their political sensibility, a consciousness with Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. And so they don't even understand how you could go from that to where we are. It's hard for me, but at least, I have a mother who grew up during the Civil Rights Movement. And so I have a little bit more consciousness of it, but I think it is a shock to people to realize that we have to relitigate our right to be. We have to relitigate a civil society. We have to relitigate the idea that we won't have terror on our streets, and that the way that happened before is so terrifying that none of the people that I know are actually facing up to how terrifying it is. Everybody's looking away. Everybody's wishing. Everybody's assuming that things will snap back to normal. Everybody says, I can't wait until the midterms or to the next election, as if there is not a possibility that they won't look like they've always looked. We're all in a bit of a daydream. Even the people who say, we've been here before, black people have been here before, we know how to do this. You haven't read enough history. Mm-mm. You haven't read enough history because you don't understand the decades of horror. There was fighting back during those decades, but it was horrific. It was horrific. And if any of our ancestors who lived through that heard us say, we've been here before, we know how to do it, they would slap the taste out of our mouth. Literally.
Did anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I'll jump in. I want to go back to something I think that Hank said that was really profound and link it to what Charles just said, which is that we're in the middle of a depression. And I think that we can be both shocked and not surprised all at once, and that shock is connected to a real serious depression, and the not surprised is connected to and dancing with the depression for many of us now, right? For many of us in this room. I think the bill of goods that we were sold, that we have bought into, is that individual rights for those who were not included in the Constitution to begin with exists and is our way to freedom. And so I want to also go back to meet me at we, me, right? Which I think might have been the most important thing that I heard this whole 2 days. Meet me at me, we, right? At the piece that is at the Studio Museum of Harlem, right? That Glenn Ligon's piece, because it is me's relationship to the collective. It is the individual rights connected to the collective rights for African Americans that enlivens the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that I think are critical and crucial to our way out of this. And that's one thing that the convention movement teaches us, right, is that the slave narrative is an I story. It starts with I was born, right, and it ends in freedom. And it's an individual story, which we say is the beginning of the African American literary tradition. But if we look at the conventions, those narratives and those proceedings and those speeches are written collectively in committee, right? They are written together, right? So when Garnett says there are addresses to white folks and there are addresses to black citizens. He calls them black citizens in the 1830s and 40s. And then there's these addresses to white citizens. And he says, we need to turn to the slaves and write an address to the slaves, right? When Henry Highland Garnett says this, he insists on writing it within the convention movement. He could have done this by himself, right? But he insists on writing it together and then fights it out in committee when Frederick Douglass says, no, that's too radical. We also think that, I think, we tend to lean back on the fact that that because we believe in the same things, we have the same tactics to get there. And the movement, right, the Color Conventions movement shows us the heterogeneity of thought that is true of all humans, right? The heterogeneity of tactics. The frenemies, like Douglass don't get him, he don't love everybody, and everybody don't love Frederick Douglass, right? In terms of the leaders, and we need to figure out how to move on strategy when we disagree on tactic, right? We got to do that, and we've got to figure out how we do it so that we think our individual success, that's the drug to me, right? So that the individual success does not think that we don't think that that is a moat somehow or an indicator or representative of the fact that they won't come for us collectively, which we are seeing right now.
I also think that the hardest reality is that we just can't ever get comfortable. I think a lot of us got real comfortable. And most of the advancement that we've seen for social justice and human rights were people who were uncomfortable, and they got up and they made and dreamt and imagined a world that they not would be comfortable, but where they could live, where they could breathe. And so I had a point, though. I was going to say something.
That was a point.
But that is a point. I didn't mean to take that away.
It's a good point.
But that's something. Oh, my point. I had a challenge. How many people here have organized a convening? Raise your hand.
Organized a
Convening.
That's a lot of people, right? Now, how many people here have not organized a convening? Up to 10 or more people.
Okay, few.
Okay. I think what I take away from what you've said is that we all need to be creating more and more convenings such as this. And a lot of us have experience, so we can share with those who have not done this before. And there's this necessity, I think, in moments like this to gather, especially with people who you agree with on strategy, but you may not, no, you agree with on
Strategy, but maybe not tactics.
strategy, but maybe not tactics, to get together. Because when we think about this, the culture of surveillance that we've become, self-surveillance, I'm right here, I want everyone to know what I'm thinking, but like, when do we actually get to cultivate our ideas? And how do we communicate our differences in person rather than in a chat room or online somewhere? So I challenge everyone here in the next 5 years to create a convening of 10 or more people and call it that, with this memory that this tradition that actually a lot of these people also saw each other in church. There are other ways for people to get together, where now the fact that this many people took 2 days off to actually be in person is something that is so rare.
You said 10 or more? I can raise my hand. I think I've done that.
Yeah.
Look at it. He's in.
We have to wrap it up, but Martha, I wanted to give you one last chance to weigh in.
Well, sure. So I want to pick up
Wait,
on
one
this.
second. This is challenge accepted.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I could, because I want to pick up on this. There was a question earlier in our discussions in these 2 days about where do we go for sustenance, where do we go for hope, and I think partly your challenge is an answer. I spent Sunday afternoon in Baltimore, which is where I live, hosted by Derek Adams, artist Derek Adams. And some of you may know that in Baltimore, Derek has stood up what he calls the Charm City Cultural Cultivation Project. And Derek has created spaces for us, for our convenings. And I spent Sunday afternoon struggling with a little bit of writer's block, and picked myself up and went to Zora's Den, which is a writing space for Black women in Baltimore. And there were 12 of us, and it was a convening. And mostly we were in our laptops and in our essays and in our books and whatever else it was that was haunting us a little bit, but we did it in community. And I, for one, but I think many of us came away fueled, prepared for Monday, whatever that might bring. So I think there's great wisdom. And the thing I want to say about that space is that it was quiet, right? That it wasn't all about wringing our hands or grief or doomsday scenarios. It was really about, in part, how do we keep doing the work, right? When everything around us would deprive us of doing the work. And in a way, it was about Derek's vision for us, his gift to us of this space, but it was all of us being willing to, me get out of my pajamas and into my sweats, that's all it was, right? But it was that in order to be in community and to prepare myself for the week ahead. So I thank you for the challenge, and I accept.
I accept as well.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have, but thank you so much for coming and sharing with the audience, and thank you so much for being here.